One of the first pieces of writing advice every writer is given is show, don't tell. This phrase is so common it verges on cliché. But saying show, don't tell is very different than demonstrating it and actually doing it. So today I want to share how to show, don't tell in creative writing. What does showing look like on the page? What does telling look like? Showing backstory, setting, and emotion can be the difference between a slow, bland story and one that compels a reader to turn the page. This is Ignited Ink Writing, a channel dedicated to helping writers like you transform your writing so it lingers with your readers. Because writing that lingers gets remembered and recommended to others. I'm Caitlin Burvey, editor and writer. Let's start with showing versus telling backstory. One of the easiest places to slip into telling is backstory. Often, writers feel the need to dump everything they think their readers need to know about their characters and what happened before the story in one chunk. This has all sorts of problems. One of those is it tends to be telling. When you tell backstory, you halt the forward momentum of your piece, and readers often start to skim and lose interest. We don't want this. So here's an example of telling. David and Anna had been married for 25 years and were just as devoted to each other as when they'd first met. Anna had miscarried 6 times. After the last one had to be delivered stillborn via C-section, they decided children weren't in their cards. This passage is telling the reader David and Anna's history. It's saying how they felt about each other for the past 25 years and that they weren't able to have children. What it's not doing is revealing how these characters feel about each other right now and what's happening in the present in their story. Those are things you get when you show backstory. There are several ways to show backstory. The one that usually comes to mind first is a flashback. A flashback is still wholly backstory, but it's told in a whole scene. This means that it has showing elements to it. Backstory can also be revealed in dialogue if characters are talking about something happened in their past. You do need to be careful that that one doesn't become an info dump where you're just telling the reader something you think they need to know instead of allowing your characters to have an actual conversation. And the last one is you can weave backstory into the current scene and into what's happening in the moment. So here's what happens when that previous example is rewritten to weave the backstory in. David tugged one of Anna's graying curls while she did her makeup like he had every morning for the last 25 years. She batted his hand away and shot him a soft smile. "Do you think it will be too hot for this sweater?" asked Anna. "It is supposed to be in the 80s, said David. She nodded, tossed her makeup in the drawer, and pulled the sweater over her head. With a grin, he wrapped his arms around her stomach, caressed the C-section scar from their final attempt at children, and kissed her neck. What we see in this second version is how David and Anna are still currently in love. This is shown through the way they interact with each other, both physically and verbally. We also are shown Anna's C-section scar and know that it wasn't her only miscarriage. We don't know that she had exactly 6, but do we really need to? We are also aware of what's happening in the present. So the scene weaves information from their past into what's happening right now, and it shows how it is relevant to the current story. That's what happens when you show backstory instead of just telling it. When backstory is shown properly, it can reveal more than pages of description. It can divulge a secret or moment from the past and show how that is still affecting the present. Shown backstory also creates the opportunity for vulnerability and intimacy in a way that told backstory doesn't. Shown backstory creates space for emotion. Let's move on to showing versus telling setting. Telling a reader about the setting for your story can adequately describe the environment, and it does have its place. But when that's all you do, the setting becomes just a literal backdrop instead of a part of your story. Essentially, you are hitting the pause button on your story to describe the setting. This slows the pacing, can annoy readers, and creates passages that readers skim. Here's an example of told setting. The high noon desert sun baked the sand and sparse plants until even the cactus seemed to droop. The monolithic sandstones offered little to no shade, but did provide a break in the horizon. A hot breeze raced by every now and again, stirring up the scent of dirt, creosote, and sage. While this is a vivid description using 3 of the 5 senses, it's more telling than showing. What this doesn't have is action, movement, characters, or plot. When an author really shows the setting, they go beyond the facts of what it looks like and feels like to how it's impacting the story. They allow emotion in, and they allow things to happen. Showing setting pushes that description to do more for your story and scene. One thing setting is great at doing when shown is establishing the mood of your scene. Mood is the emotion your reader feels when they're reading that section. If you don't have a mood, they don't feel anything, which means they're probably going to stop reading. Here's one way the desert description could be rewritten to show. Dashing to the nearest sandstone, I felt the rubber soles of my shoes grow soft with heat from the sand. I'd run out of sweat 30 minutes ago, but I had to push through the dizziness and could only afford to press my back against the tiny sliver of shaded stone for a moment. Nina needed me, and I owed her. I filled my lungs with a dirt, creosote, and sage-scented hot breath and ran on. This shown passage contains most of the descriptions from the previous example. We know the air was hot, we know what it smelled like, we know that we're in this desert. But this character, this I person, is interacting with the setting. The setting becomes more than a backdrop and an obstacle that she has to overcome. The best settings are ones that do affect your story. When you can take your story and move it from this place to this place, you're not using your setting the way you should. When setting is used appropriately, the story loses something when it is moved somewhere else. This is especially true if you're writing science fiction and fantasy, historical fiction, something along those lines. The story you're telling should only be able to be told in that place and time. Otherwise, why isn't it just a contemporary novel? Why are you going to all of this extra work? You can show setting in a variety of ways. A storm can mimic the tension of a current conflict. You can have a character interacting with it, like in the above paragraph. You can even use setting to show the passage of time. If you show how the world has changed, readers know time has passed. The key to showing setting is not allowing it to become stagnant. Next, let's talk about showing versus telling emotion. One of the most important times to show instead of tell is when it comes to emotion. If I tell you a character is angry, I'm not really telling you very much. I'm not telling you how that anger is affecting their decision-making, how it feels in their body, even how angry they are. You can answer all of these questions and more when you take that line where you told the reader the emotion and show them instead. Here's an example of a line that tells a reader how they feel, and then is transformed into a few lines that show that emotion. Joe was pissed Brian waited until now to mention he was dating Joe's ex. Becomes. At the revelation Brian was dating his ex, every muscle in Joe's body tensed. He resisted the impulse to punch Brian in his stupid face and grinned. I gave her herpes, he said. The only information conveyed in the first line is that Joe is mad. In the second example, we're never told Joe is mad. We are shown his anger through his physical response and what he says to Brian. We're also shown how he deals with that anger. He chooses not to lash out with his fist, but with his tongue instead. That says more about his character than simply stating he was angry ever could. By showing your character's emotions, you develop them further. There are lots of ways to do this. Here we're seeing two. One is physical, and the other is in dialogue. You can also show emotion through how a character is interacting with their environment. Next, I want to share why an editor recommends showing instead of telling. Showing, backstory, setting, and emotion provide the opportunity to dive deeper into your characters and plot, and to reveal more information about them and your story. However, I wouldn't say you always need to show. There are some instances when telling is necessary. Maybe you only need one line about a character's emotion because they're a minor character or it's not affecting your story. Maybe you need to just get a few lines of backstory out really quickly so you're not interrupting the pace of what's happening. Those are times when it is perfectly acceptable to tell instead of show. So there is a balance between the two, but it is not an equal balance. You shouldn't have half showing and half telling. That's way too much telling. Readers want to feel immersed in your story. You immerse them by showing them. You'll have to take a look at each instance of showing and telling in your story to decide which one is best for that moment. So when do you prefer to show and tell in your writing? Share those situations in the comments below. And for more videos demonstrating what people mean by common phrases like show, don't tell in writing, subscribe to Ignited Ink Writing, a channel dedicated to helping writers like you transform your writing so it lingers with your readers. Because writing that lingers gets remembered and recommended to others. I'm Caitlin Burvey, editor and writer. You can find out more about me at www.ignitedinkwriting.com. There you will also find a list of writing books I recommend all authors explore. And now it's your turn to take a look at your backstory, setting, and emotions and decide when you should show versus tell to ignite your ink.